Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez stared at the disciplinary notice for the fourth time in 20 minutes. The official Navy letterhead swimming before her eyes like the storm clouds gathering outside her quarters at Naval Air Station Meridian. Falls. Due to your unauthorized deviation from standard communication protocols during the Hurricane Katrina simulation exercise, you are hereby relieved of flight training duties effective immediately. She crumpled the paper with trembling hands and hurled it across the cramped room, where it joined 3 similar notices from the past 8 months, each one another nail in the coffin of her aviation dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what would happen next would transform this communications officer into the pilot, who would attempt the most dangerous rescue mission in Navy aviation history, flying a V-22 Osprey through Category 4 hurricane winds at 50 feet above churning. Seas to save 127 souls trapped on a collapsing oil platform. This is the story of how the woman who couldn't follow radio procedures became the aviator who rewrote the book on impossible flying. 3 flight programs, 3 failures. 3 dreams shattered against the unforgiving reality of military aviation. Standards that seemed designed to crush anyone who dared to think differently. The irony wasn't lost on Elena as she sat in her government-issued chair, surrounded by the tools of her actual trade sophisticated radio equipment, satellite communication, arrays and computer systems that connected naval operations across 3 time zones. Here she was, a decorated communications specialist with 6 years of flawless service, an expert who had coordinated rescue operations during 3 major hurricanes, managed communications for carrier battle groups in hostile waters, and earned commendations for her ability to maintain contact with aircraft in the most challenging conditions imaginable. She could talk pilots through instrument failures when they couldn't see their own wingtips through fog. She could coordinate multi-aircraft rescue operations during tropical storms, her voice the calm constant that guided helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft through weather that grounded commercial aviation. She had been the communications link that saved 43 people during Hurricane Delilah when the Coast Guard lost contact with their search aircraft for 6 hours. Her voice had guided pilots home when their navigation systems failed, when their radios were damaged, when they were flying on fumes and prayer through storms that would make seasoned aviators weep, but put her behind the controls of an aircraft and apparently she became a catastrophic liability. The first failure had come at Naval Flight Training Command in Corpus Christi. Basic helicopter training, something thousands of officers completed without incident. Elena had passed every written exam with scores in the top 5%, demonstrated perfect understanding of aerodynamics, weather theory, and emergency procedures. But during her practical flight tests, she had consistently violated protocol by attempting maneuvers that instructors deemed unnecessarily aggressive and outside established safety parameters. When other students followed standard procedures for simulated emergencies, Elena improvised solutions that worked but weren't in the manual. The decisive moment had come during a simulated engine failure exercise. While her instructor expected her to follow the standard auto-rotation procedure and land in the designated emergency field, Elena had noticed that the emergency scenario placed them over a simulated populated area. Instead of following protocol, she had attempted a more complex maneuver to reach what she argued was a safer landing zone, one that wouldn't endanger civilian lives in a real emergency. The maneuver had been technically successful. She had demonstrated exceptional aircraft control and situational awareness, but it had earned her an immediate dismissal from the program. Inability to follow established procedures, her evaluation had read. Tendency to deviate from proven safety. Protocols, not recommended for continuation in flight training. The second attempt had been 8 months later at Naval Air Training Command Whidbey Island, where she had applied for fixed-wing training. Surely, she had reasoned, flying larger aircraft with more stable handling characteristics would suit her better. She had thrown herself into the program with the determination of someone who knew this was her second chance. Again, her academic performance had been exemplary. Her understanding of complex aircraft systems, navigation, and emergency procedures had impressed instructors who noted her exceptional grasp of theoretical concepts and superior analytical abilities. But during practical training flights, the same pattern had emerged. Elena's instincts consistently led her to question standard procedures when they didn't account for real-world variables. During a simulated navigation exercise, she had deviated from the planned route to avoid weather that her instruments indicated was more severe than the briefing had suggested. Her decision had been vindicated when other aircraft following the original route encountered severe turbulence, but her instructors had been furious about her failure to stick to the flight plan. The final straw had come during a formation flying exercise. When the lead aircraft's radio failed and the pilot began executing what Elena recognized as an emergency procedure, she had broken formation to provide assistance, a decision that probably prevented a serious accident, but violated every rule about maintaining formation discipline. The incident report had praised her exceptional situational awareness and quick thinking, while simultaneously recommending her removal from the program for inability to maintain formation discipline and follow standardized procedures. Her third and final attempt had been the most crushing of all. The V-22 Osprey program at Marine Corps Air Station New River represented the pinnacle of military aviation, a revolutionary aircraft that combined the vertical capability of a helicopter with the speed and range of a fixed-wing airplane. It was exactly the kind of challenging, cutting-edge aviation that had drawn Elena to flying in the first place. The Osprey was an aircraft that demanded pilots who could think on their feet, who could manage complex systems and make split-second decisions in rapidly changing situations. Elena had been convinced that this was her perfect match. The Osprey's complexity and unconventional flight characteristics seemed designed for someone with her analytical mind and intuitive grasp of aircraft behavior. For the first 2 months of training, everything had seemed to click. Her instructors had noted her exceptional ability to manage complex aircraft transitions and her intuitive understanding of tiltrotor aerodynamics. But the program's emphasis on standardized procedures had once again become her downfall. During a simulated rescue scenario, Elena had been tasked with extracting personnel from a hostile environment. The scenario called for a specific approach pattern and extraction sequence, but Elena had recognized that the prescribed method would expose the aircraft to unnecessary risk from simulated enemy fire. She had improvised a different approach that completed the mission more safely and efficiently, but her innovation had been interpreted as an inability to follow orders. The final evaluation had been devastating. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez demonstrates exceptional flying ability and outstanding situational awareness. However, her consistent deviation from established procedures indicates a fundamental incompatibility with military aviation standards. While her instincts may be sound, the military requires pilots who can execute standardized procedures without deviation, not recommended for pilot certification. Now, as rain began to streak the windows of her quarters at Meridian Falls, Elena faced the reality that her aviation dreams were over. At 28, she was too old to start over in civilian flight training, and her military record of flight training failures would follow her anywhere she tried to pursue aviation. The storm outside seemed fitting. Hurricane Beatrice was forming in the Gulf of Mexico, and weather reports suggested it would become a major hurricane within 48 hours. Elena's secure satellite phone buzzed against her desk, the distinctive tone that indicated an emergency communication from Atlantic Fleet Operations. She glanced at the caller identification and felt her stomach drop. Vice Admiral Patricia Montgomery. commander of Naval Air Forces Atlantic, and the highest-ranking woman in Navy aviation. Elena had met the admiral only once, during a commendation ceremony 2 years earlier, but Admiral Montgomery's reputation preceded her. A former test pilot who had flown combat missions in 3 conflicts and was known for her ability to see potential where others saw only problems, Elena answered with military precision, a habit that remains strong even in her current state of professional devastation. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, Naval Communications, Meridian Falls. Elena, the Admiral's voice carried that familiar blend of authority and warmth that marked true military leaders. I heard about the Osprey program. Elena closed her eyes, wondering how quickly bad news traveled through Navy aviation circles. Ma'am, I understand that my flight training record speaks for itself. Cut the formalities, Lieutenant Commander. You know why I'm calling. Elena didn't, actually, but she had learned that admitting ignorance to flag officers was rarely the best strategy. Through her window, she could see the first outer bands of Hurricane Beatrice beginning to affect the base, with palm trees starting to bend in the increasing wind. The Weather Service had upgraded their forecasts. Beatrice was now predicted to reach Category 4 strength before making landfall somewhere along the Gulf Coast. Ma'am, Elena said carefully, I'm not sure I understand. Admiral Montgomery's pause was pregnant with meaning. Elena, for the past 6 years, you've been the voice that guides our pilots home when everything goes wrong. You've coordinated rescue operations that saved hundreds of lives, managed communications during carrier operations in the most challenging conditions, and earned the respect of every aviator who's ever worked with you. Tell me, what do you think? The difference is between talking someone through an emergency and flying through one yourself. Elena considered the question, watching the storm intensify outside her window. I suppose. When you're talking someone through it, you can see the whole picture. You have access to weather data, radar information, the big picture that the pilot might not have. But when you're flying, you're limited to what you can see and feel in the moment. Exactly wrong, Admiral Montgomery said, and Elena could hear something that sounded almost like satisfaction in her voice. When you're on the radio, you're managing information. When you're flying, you're managing reality. The question is, are you ready to find out what you're really capable of when you're not limited by other people's procedures? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena stood at her communications console, rain now hammering against the reinforced windows of the Naval Communications Center with increasing intensity. The irony of her situation had never been more stark. Here she was, surrounded by the tools that made her one of the most respected communications officers in the Atlantic Fleet, yet unable to translate that expertise into the cockpit of an aircraft. Walls around her workstation told the story of 6 years of exemplary service that seemed to mock her aviation failures. Her commendation for coordinating rescue operations during Hurricane Delilah hung next to a letter of appreciation from the captain of the USS Intrepid, thanking her for maintaining communications during a storm that had knocked out satellite links across the Caribbean. Below that, a photograph showed her receiving the Navy Achievement Medal for her role in guiding 37 search and rescue aircraft during the cruise ship disaster off Cape Hatteras, an operation that had saved over 400 lives in seas so rough that waves were breaking over the ship's upper decks. Elena could remember that night with perfect clarity. For 14 hours, she had been the calm voice in the storm, the invisible hand that orchestrated one of the largest civilian rescue operations in Navy history. When Hurricane Ezra had slammed into the Caribbean cruise ship Majestic Voyager, turning a luxury vacation into a nightmare of listing decks and flooding compartments, Elena had been the one to coordinate the response. She had managed communications between Coast Guard cutters, Navy helicopters, merchant vessels, and civilian aircraft, a complex dance of rescue assets, operating in conditions that pushed both equipment and personnel to their absolute limits. The cruise ship had been taking on water faster than the pumps could handle, listing 30 degrees to starboard in 40-foot seas. Commercial aviation had been grounded, and even military aircraft were operating at the edge of their capabilities. Elena had tracked weather patterns, monitored fuel states, coordinated landing sequences on Coast Guard cutters, and guided pilots through approach after approach in visibility so poor that they were flying on instruments alone. Rescue 7, this is Meridian Base. She had called to a Coast Guard helicopter fighting its way through 90-knot winds to reach the ship. Your approach vector is taking you into the worst of the wind shear. Recommend coming around to heading 270 and using the ship's superstructure to break the wind. The pilot's voice had been tight with stress as he fought his aircraft through conditions that would have grounded most helicopters. Meridian Base, I can't see anything out here. Instruments are giving me conflicting readings, and I've got people in the water. Elena had pulled up real-time weather radar, satellite imagery, and the ship's GPS position, creating a three-dimensional picture of the rescue environment that no single pilot could have assembled from the cockpit. Rescue 7, you're currently at bearing 095 from the ship, distance 2 miles. The wind is creating a pocket of calmer air on the ship's lee side. Come left to heading 240, descend to 200 feet, and I'll talk you in. For the next 40 minutes, Elena had guided the helicopter through approach after approach, each one more challenging than the last as the storm intensified. She had monitored the aircraft's fuel consumption, tracked the movement of debris in the water, and coordinated with the ship's bridge to ensure that rescue baskets didn't collide with the vessel's superstructure. When the helicopter's navigation system failed completely, Elena had become its eyes and ears, using radar tracking and radio direction finding to guide the aircraft safely to each pickup point. Meridian Base, you just saved 17 lives. The Coast Guard pilot had radioed after completing his final approach. I couldn't have done any of that without your guidance. You've got better situational awareness from 300 miles away than I have sitting right here. It was a pattern that had repeated itself throughout Elena's career. During Tropical Storm Francis, she had guided a damaged Navy helicopter with a critically injured pilot back to base when all the aircraft's navigation equipment had been knocked out by lightning. The pilot had been disoriented, possibly concussed, unable to read his instruments or maintain orientation in the storm. Elena had used primary radar tracking to vector the helicopter home, talking the injured pilot through each control input necessary to keep the aircraft flying. Just follow my voice, she had told him, watching the radar blip that represented his helicopter weaving erratically through the storm. You're drifting left. Add a little right rudder. Now bring your nose up slightly. You're losing altitude. That's it. Perfect. You're flying beautifully. The pilot had landed safely, and the Navy surgeon who treated his head injury later said that 5 more minutes in the air would have meant unconsciousness and certain death. Elena had literally talked a dying pilot back to life, using nothing but radar coordinates and her understanding of aircraft behavior. Her expertise extended far beyond emergency situations. Elena had designed new communication protocols that improved coordination between different types of rescue aircraft, reducing response times and eliminating the radio conflicts that had previously plagued multi-agency operations. She had written training manuals on aviation communications that were now used throughout the Atlantic Fleet, and her techniques for managing high-stress radio traffic had been adopted by the Coast Guard and civilian emergency services. Most remarkably, Elena possessed what aviators called the sight, an almost supernatural ability to visualize aircraft movement and behavior from radio communications alone. She could tell when a pilot was experiencing vertigo before the pilot realized it himself, simply from subtle changes in voice patterns and radio technique. She could predict mechanical problems by analyzing the timing and content of pilot transmissions, often detecting issues before aircraft instruments registered any abnormalities. "Elena doesn't just hear what you're saying," Captain James Rodriguez of the Coast Guard had written in one evaluation. "She hears what your aircraft is doing, what the weather is doing, and what you're thinking. I've seen her predict equipment failures 20 minutes before they happen, just from listening to how a pilot talks. She understands flying better than most people who've been doing it for 20 years. But understanding flying and actually flying were apparently two completely different skills." Elena could visualize complex aircraft maneuvers with perfect clarity, could predict how different weather conditions would affect aircraft performance, could manage the mental workload of coordinating multiple aircraft in challenging conditions. But she couldn't make her hands and feet work together to control an aircraft according to Navy standards. The problem wasn't fear. Elena had requested assignment to forward operating bases during 2 conflicts, had volunteered for deployment aboard carriers operating in hostile waters, and had never shown the slightest hesitation about flying as a passenger in military aircraft. Under the most challenging conditions, she had ridden along on dozens of rescue missions, observing operations from the co-pilot seat of helicopters and transport aircraft, always eager to understand how aerial operations worked from the inside. The problem wasn't spatial orientation or situational awareness. Elena could navigate using backup instruments when primary systems failed, could maintain perfect awareness of aircraft position and attitude, even when visual references were completely obscured. Her instructors consistently noted her exceptional understanding of 3-dimensional aircraft movement and her superior ability to maintain situational awareness in complex environments. The problem wasn't technical knowledge. Elena had scored higher on written examinations than 95% of Navy pilot candidates, demonstrating mastery of aerodynamics, weather theory, aircraft systems, and emergency procedures that exceeded the knowledge level of many certified aviators. She could explain the physics of flight with the precision of an engineering professor and troubleshoot complex aircraft systems with the expertise of a senior maintenance technician. The problem, according to every flight instructor she had ever worked with, was her inability to follow standardized procedures when those procedures didn't account for real-world variables. Elena's mind worked too quickly, analyzed too many factors, considered too many possibilities. Where Navy aviation demanded adherence to proven protocols, Elena instinctively improvised solutions that were often better than the FAA's standard procedures but weren't in the manual. "Vasquez thinks like a flight surgeon," one instructor had written. "Not like a pilot. She wants to understand why we do things a certain way instead of just doing them. In emergency situations, that kind of thinking could get people killed." Military aviation requires pilots who can execute standard procedures without hesitation, not innovators who want to reinvent techniques that have been proven safe through decades of use. It was the kind of evaluation that would have ended most people's aviation dreams permanently. But Elena had never been able to accept that her ability to see solutions that others missed was somehow a liability rather than an asset. She had continued to believe that there must be some type of flying, some environment where her analytical approach and intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior would be valued rather than criticized. Now, watching Hurricane Beatrice build strength outside her window, Elena wondered if she would ever get the chance to prove that her unconventional thinking could be an asset rather than a handicap. Admiral Montgomery's cryptic question echoed in her mind. Are you ready to find out what you're really capable of when you're not limited by other people's procedures? Through the storm-lashed window, Elena could see maintenance crews securing aircraft and equipment as Hurricane Beatrice's outer bands reached Naval Air Station Meridian Falls. Somewhere out in the Gulf of Mexico, the storm was gathering the kind of fury that would test every aspect of military aviation capability. Elena had coordinated rescue operations during major hurricanes before, but something in Admiral Montgomery's voice suggested that Hurricane Beatrice would demand something different, something that might finally give Elena the chance to discover whether her unique approach to aviation was a fatal flaw or an untapped strength. Elena stared at the secure satellite phone for a full 5 seconds after Admiral Montgomery's question, watching the rain streak down the reinforced windows of the communications center. The hurricane's outer bands were beginning to show their true power now, with wind gusts strong enough to rattle the building's steel frame. Outside, she could see maintenance crews struggling to secure the last of the aircraft in hardened hangars, their movements urgent as meteorologists continued to upgrade Hurricane Beatrice's projected intensity. "Ma'am," Elena said carefully, "I'm not entirely sure I understand what you're asking." Admiral Montgomery's laugh was sharp, cutting through the static on the encrypted line. "Elena, let me ask you something. In your professional opinion, what's the maximum wind speed at which a V-22 Osprey can safely conduct rescue operations?" Elena's mind immediately went to the technical specifications she had memorized during her failed Osprey training program. According to flight manual limitations, the V-22 should not operate in sustained winds exceeding 45 knots, with gust spreads no greater than 15 knots. In helicopter mode, crosswind limitations are even more restrictive. "I didn't ask you what the manual says," Admiral Montgomery interrupted. "I asked you what you think is actually possible." Elena paused, recognizing the distinction. During her years coordinating rescue operations, she had observed aircraft operating in conditions that technically exceeded their published limitations, guided by pilots who understood the difference between conservative planning parameters and actual aircraft capabilities. She had talked helicopters through approaches in 50-knot winds when people were dying and standard procedures would have meant abandoning the mission. In helicopter mode, with an experienced pilot who understands how to use terrain and wind patterns for protection, probably 60 knots sustained with higher gusts. In airplane mode, significantly higher, but transitions would be extremely dangerous. The real limitation isn't the aircraft. It's the pilot's ability to manage the workload and maintain control during rapid configuration changes. Good answer. Now tell me this, if you had to coordinate a rescue operation for 127 people on an offshore platform during a Category 4 hurricane, what would be your biggest concern? Elena felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't a hypothetical conversation anymore. Hurricane Beatrice was tracking directly toward the Gulf Coast, where dozens of offshore oil platforms housed thousands of workers. Standard evacuation procedures called for platforms to be evacuated well in advance of major storms, but sometimes things went wrong. Equipment failures, medical emergencies, or simply the speed at which hurricanes could intensify meant that people occasionally found themselves trapped in situations where evacuation became a rescue mission. Time and aircraft capability, Elena answered immediately. Standard rescue helicopters can't operate in hurricane conditions, and they don't have the range to reach platforms in the deep Gulf during severe weather. Coast Guard assets would be grounded or limited to nearshore operations. You'd need aircraft with the speed to reach distant platforms quickly and the capability to operate in extreme weather, such as V-22 Ospreys. They have the range and speed to reach deep water platforms, and their flight characteristics might allow operations in conditions that would ground conventional helicopters. But the pilot workload would be enormous, managing transitions between helicopter and airplane mode in severe turbulence, conducting precision approaches to small platforms in high winds, coordinating with platform personnel while fighting just to keep the aircraft controllable. Admiral Montgomery was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could hear the sound of papers shuffling and what sounded like multiple conversations in the background. "Elena, I'm going to share some information with you." And I need you to understand that this conversation is classified at the highest levels. Are we clear? Yes, ma'am. At 1400 hours today, Platform Deep Horizon 7 suffered a catastrophic failure of their primary evacuation systems. They're operating on emergency power. Their helicopter landing deck is partially damaged, and their crew boat dock was destroyed by debris from the platform superstructure. They have 127 personnel on board, including 12 who are trapped in a section of the platform that's flooding, but structurally stable for now. Elena felt her blood run cold. Deep Horizon 7 was one of the newest and largest platforms in the Gulf, positioned nearly 200 miles from the Louisiana coast in water too deep for conventional rescue methods. In normal conditions, platform evacuation would be handled by a combination of helicopters and crew boats, with personnel transported to shore-based facilities or nearby vessels. But Hurricane Beatrice had intensified faster than predicted, and the storm's track was taking it directly over the platform's position. Ma'am, with Hurricane Beatrice's current track and intensity, that platform is going to be experiencing hurricane force. Winds within 12 hours. Are you telling me that 127 people are going to be trapped on an offshore platform during a direct hit from a Category 4 hurricane? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Coast Guard assets are already grounded due to weather conditions, and their helicopters don't have the range to reach Deep Horizon 7, even if they could launch. Navy rescue assets are similarly limited. The platform's emergency protocols call for personnel to shelter in place in the platform's safe room, but early reports suggest that the flooding may compromise even those areas. Elena stared out at the storm, trying to process the magnitude of what Admiral Montgomery was describing. She had coordinated rescue operations during major hurricanes before, but never anything involving people trapped offshore during a direct hit from a major storm. The logistics alone were staggering. Any rescue aircraft would have to fly through hurricane conditions to reach the platform, conduct multiple extractions from a partially damaged landing area while fighting extreme winds and turbulence, then return through the storm to safety. Admiral, are you asking me to coordinate communications for a rescue operation to Deep Horizon 7? No, Elena. I'm asking you if you want to fly it. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. For a moment, she was certain she had misheard. Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. I'm not qualified to fly the V-22. I was dismissed from the Osprey program 8 months ago. You were dismissed for not following standardized procedures during peacetime training exercises. This isn't a training exercise, and there are no standardized procedures for flying rescue missions through Category 4 hurricanes. The question isn't whether you can follow the manual, it's whether you can improvise solutions when the manual doesn't cover the situation you're facing. Elena's mind raced through the implications of what Admiral Montgomery was suggesting. Flying an Osprey through hurricane conditions would require exactly the kind of innovative thinking and real-time problem-solving that had gotten her expelled from flight training programs. The mission would demand a pilot who could analyze rapidly changing conditions, improvise new approaches when standard procedures failed, and make split-second decisions based on incomplete information. Precisely the skills that had made her such an effective communications coordinator. Admiral, even if I were qualified, I haven't flown an Osprey in 8 months. I have no recent flight experience, no current certifications, no. Elena, you've coordinated more rescue operations than most pilots have flown. You understand aircraft performance, weather effects, and emergency procedures better than 90% of our certified aviators. What you lack is confidence in your own abilities and permission to use your judgment instead of following someone else's rules. Through the phone, Elena could hear the unmistakable sound of aircraft engines spooling up, the high-pitched whine of turbines preparing for flight operations. Somewhere at Meridian Falls, despite the deteriorating weather conditions, aircraft were being prepared for missions that would take them into the teeth of Hurricane Beatrice. Ma'am, who else is being considered for this mission? Admiral Montgomery's pause was telling. Elena, I'm going to be completely honest with you. This mission is being classified as a suicide run by every experienced Osprey pilot we've consulted. The weather conditions, the distance, the precision required for multiple extractions from a damaged platform, it's beyond what anyone considers survivable. Our most experienced pilots are recommending that we wait for the storm to pass and conduct recovery operations instead of rescue operations. Elena understood the distinction immediately. Recovery operations meant retrieving bodies after the storm. Rescue operations meant saving lives during the storm. And you disagree with their assessment. I think that 127 people deserve someone who's willing to try something that's never been attempted before. I think this mission requires a pilot who sees possibilities instead of limitations. And I think you might be the only person in the Navy who has both the technical knowledge and the unconventional thinking necessary to pull this off. The weight of Admiral Montgomery's words settled over Elena like a physical presence. Outside, Hurricane Beatrice continued to intensify its outer bands, now bringing sustained winds of over 50 knots to the Naval Air Station. In 12 hours, those winds would be battering Deep Horizon 7 with sustained speeds of over 130 knots, creating conditions that would make survival on the platform questionable and rescue operations seemingly impossible. But Elena found herself thinking not about the impossibility of the mission, but about the technical challenges it would present. Flying an Osprey through hurricane conditions would require precise management of the aircraft's complex systems, real-time analysis of constantly changing weather patterns, and the ability to improvise new approach techniques when standard procedures proved inadequate. It would demand exactly the kind of multidimensional thinking that had made her such an effective communications coordinator. Admiral, Elena said slowly, if I were to attempt this mission, what kind of support would be available? Limited. Weather conditions will prevent most support aircraft from operating. You'd be essentially on your own once you launch, with communication support from shore-based facilities and whatever weather information we can provide via satellite link. The platform has emergency communications capability, but their systems may not survive much longer. Elena looked around the communications center where she had spent 6 years building a reputation as one of the Navy's most capable coordinators of complex aviation operations. Every piece of equipment in the room represented her expertise in managing the kind of multivariable challenges that the Deep Horizon 7 mission would present. The difference was that this time, instead of coordinating the mission from a distance, she would be flying it herself. Ma'am, I need to ask one more question. Why me? Why not reassign one of the pilots who is willing to attempt the mission? Admiral Montgomery's answer came without hesitation. Because, Elena, every pilot we've consulted has told us what can't be done. You're the only person who's ever asked me what might be possible. Elena's hands tightened around the secure phone as the full implications of Admiral Montgomery's offer crashed over her, like the hurricane winds now battering the communications center. Admiral, with all due respect, I think you may be overestimating my capabilities. I've been removed from 3 flight programs specifically because I can't follow established safety protocols. Putting me in charge of a rescue mission this critical would be what, Elena? Admiral Montgomery's voice cut through her protest with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Irresponsible? Let me tell you about irresponsible. 6 months ago, we lost an entire flight crew attempting a similar mission in much less severe conditions. Elena felt her stomach drop. She had heard rumors about a rescue operation gone wrong in the Atlantic, but details had been classified and never made it into official briefings. Ma'am, I wasn't aware. Operation Neptune's Shield. Admiral Montgomery continued, her voice taking on the flat, official tone that Elena recognized from casualty notifications. Hurricane Carla, Category 3. tracking toward a disabled freighter. With 43 crew members aboard, the ship's engines had failed, and they were taking on water faster than their pumps could handle. Coast Guard assets were grounded due to weather conditions, so we launched 2 V-22s from Naval Air Station Norfolk. Elena could hear papers rustling in the background, the sound of Admiral Montgomery accessing classified files that contained the kind of operational details that never made it into public reports. The lead aircraft was piloted by Commander William Hayes, 15 years of V-22 experience, over 3,000 flight hours in the aircraft. His co-pilot was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim, 12 years of military aviation experience, expert rated in all-weather operations. The names hit Elena like physical blows. Commander Hayes had been a legend in V-22 circles, known for his textbook precision and unwavering adherence to safety protocols. Lieutenant Commander Kim had been equally respected, a pilot whose technical expertise and calm under pressure had made her a sought-after instructor at the Navy's advanced flight training schools. What happened to them? Admiral Montgomery's pause carried the weight of lost friends and failed missions. They followed established procedures exactly as written. Weather reconnaissance had determined that conditions at the freighter's position were at the extreme edge of operational limits, but still within acceptable parameters for emergency rescue operations. Both pilots had reviewed the mission profile and agreed that it fell within standard safety margins. Elena found herself holding her breath, dreading what was coming next. The approach to the freighter went according to plan initially. Hayes maintained perfect formation discipline, executed textbook transitions between helicopter and airplane mode, and conducted the initial reconnaissance exactly as outlined in the emergency rescue protocols. But when they attempted to establish a hover over the ship's deck for personnel extraction, they encountered wind conditions that exceeded their planning parameters. Through the storm-lashed windows of the communication center, Elena could see the true fury of Hurricane Beatrice beginning to assert itself. Wind gusts were now strong enough to bend mature palm trees nearly horizontal, and debris was beginning to fly through the air with deadly force. The conditions at Deep Horizon 7 would be exponentially worse than what she was witnessing from the safety of the hardened communications facility. The freighter was rolling in 30-foot seas, and the wind patterns around the ship's superstructure were creating severe turbulence that made precision hovering nearly impossible. Hayes attempted 3 approaches, each one by the book, one following established procedures for shipboard extractions in severe weather. On the 4th approach, a massive wind gust caught the Osprey during the transition from airplane to helicopter mode. Elena closed her eyes, visualizing the scenario with the clarity that came from years of coordinating similar operations. The V-22's transition from airplane to helicopter mode was its most vulnerable phase, requiring precise control inputs and perfect timing. In severe turbulence, with the additional complications of a moving ship and unpredictable wind patterns, margin for error would be virtually non-existent. The aircraft entered an unrecoverable flight condition. Hayes had perhaps 3 seconds to execute emergency procedures before impact. The official investigation concluded that both pilots performed flawlessly according to established protocols, but that the environmental conditions exceeded the operational envelope for safe V-22 operations near ships in heavy weather. Admiral Montgomery's voice took on a harder edge. 43 people on that freighter died when the ship broke apart 6 hours later. 2 of our finest pilots died attempting a rescue that our procedure said was possible, but our reality proved was not. The mission failed not because Hayes and Kim lacked skill or courage, but because they were limited by procedures that didn't account for the full complexity of the operational environment. Elena felt the weight of those losses settling over her like a shroud. She had coordinated enough rescue operations to understand the agonizing calculus that went into decisions about acceptable risk versus probable outcomes. But she had never been forced to confront the reality that sometimes following established procedures led to the very disasters those procedures were designed to prevent. Admiral, are you telling me that Commander Hayes and Lieutenant Commander Kim died because they followed the manual instead of trusting their instincts? I'm telling you that they died because the manual couldn't account for the specific combination of variables they encountered. Hayes was a by-the-book pilot who trusted that established procedures would see him through any situation he might face. When those procedures proved inadequate, he didn't have the mental flexibility to improvise solutions in real time. Elena understood the implication immediately. Her flight training failures had all stemmed from her inability to follow established procedures when those procedures didn't account for the full complexity of the situations she faced. What instructors had seen as a dangerous tendency toward improvisation, Admiral Montgomery was suggesting might be exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that could succeed where rigid adherence to protocols had failed. Ma'am, you're asking me to attempt a mission that killed 2 of our most experienced pilots, using the same type of aircraft that proved inadequate for the task, in weather conditions that are significantly worse than what they encountered. No. Elena, I'm asking you to attempt a mission that might succeed specifically because you won't be limited by the same procedural constraints that doomed the previous attempt. Hayes and Kim were exceptional pilots operating within a system that prioritizes standardization over innovation. You're an exceptional problem solver who's been penalized for thinking outside that system. Admiral Montgomery's words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Elena was still struggling to process. Through the communication center's reinforced windows, she could see maintenance crews making final preparations for the hurricane's arrival, securing equipment and aircraft with the efficiency that came from years of practice. But Hurricane Beatrice was already exceeding predicted intensity levels, and meteorologists were warning that their computer models might be underestimating the storm's ultimate strength. Admiral, even if your assessment of my capabilities is correct, there's still the question of current qualifications. I haven't flown a V-22 in 8 months. I have no recent flight physical, and I'm not current on emergency procedures specific to hurricane operations. Elena, I need you to understand something about the current situation. Deep Horizon 7 is not our only problem. Hurricane Beatrice is now tracking as a Category 4 storm with the potential to reach Category 5 intensity before landfall. We have 7 offshore platforms in the hurricane's projected path, 3 coastal installations that may require evacuation, and approximately 2,000 personnel who could potentially need emergency extraction over the next 18 hours. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she realized the scope of what Admiral Montgomery was describing. This wasn't just about saving the people trapped on Deep Horizon 7, it was about managing a potential humanitarian disaster that could involve thousands of lives and dozens of separate rescue operations. Our current rescue assets are woefully inadequate for an emergency of this magnitude. Most of our helicopters lack the range to reach deep water platforms in hurricane conditions, and our fixed-wing aircraft can't conduct the precision extractions that will be required. The V-22 program represents our only realistic option for conducting long-range rescues in extreme weather, but we have exactly 4 pilots currently qualified for hurricane operations. Admiral Montgomery paused, letting the mathematics of disaster sink in. 4 pilots, Elena. 4 pilots to potentially cover dozens of rescue missions across hundreds of square miles of ocean, in weather conditions that will push both aircraft and crews beyond their design limits. And now I'm asking one of those 4 pilots to attempt what may be the most dangerous rescue mission any of them will ever fly. Elena understood immediately. If she accepted the Deep Horizon 7 mission and failed, the Navy would lose not just her, but also one of their precious few hurricane-capable aircraft and crews. If she refused, 127 people would almost certainly die, but the Navy would retain its limited rescue capabilities for other emergencies that Hurricane Beatrice might create. Ma'am, you're asking me to risk one of our only long-range rescue assets on a mission that experienced pilots consider impossible. I'm asking you to risk one asset to save 127 lives, Elena, and I'm asking you to do it because you might be the only person who can see a way to make the impossible merely very dangerous. Elena pulled up the weather tracking system on her primary console, her fingers moving across the familiar interface with practiced efficiency, while Admiral Montgomery's words echoed in her mind. The real-time satellite imagery of Hurricane Beatrice painted a picture that made her blood run cold. The storm had continued to intensify beyond all predictions, its eye wall now clearly defined and compact, the hallmark of a hurricane that was still gathering strength. Admiral, I'm looking at the current weather data, and Beatrice is showing characteristics of rapid intensification that weren't in the morning forecast models. Current sustained winds are 135 knots with gusts exceeding 160. The storm's forward speed has increased to 18 knots, which puts Deep Horizon 7 directly in the path of the eye wall in approximately 10 hours. Elena's training as a communications specialist had taught her to think in terms of operational windows and resource allocation, skills that now allowed her to visualize the logistical nightmare that Hurricane Beatrice represented. She began pulling up additional data streams, platform locations, personnel counts, evacuation timelines, and aircraft availability. The numbers that emerged painted a picture of a disaster that was rapidly moving beyond the Navy's capacity to respond effectively. Ma'am, according to the platform registry, we have Deep Horizon 7 with 127 personnel, but there are also 6 other major installations in Beatrice's projected path. Poseidon Alpha has 93 people, Triton Station has 115, Neptune's Crown has 68, Oceanic 12 has 139, Marathon Deep has 84, and Challenger Point has 57. That's 600. 83 people total on deep-water platforms alone. Elena's fingers continued to fly across her keyboard as she pulled up additional databases. The coastal installations add another layer of complexity. Port Vermilion has a skeleton crew of 32 maintaining critical infrastructure, but they're in a mandatory evacuation zone. The Galveston Deep Water Terminal has 47 personnel who can't be evacuated by ground transportation due to flooding, and the offshore wind farm maintenance facility at Corpus Christi Bay has 21 technicians who were trapped when their crew boat suffered mechanical failure. Admiral Montgomery's silence on the other end of the line told Elena that she was confirming numbers that the Admiral already knew, but hearing them laid out in stark mathematical terms made the scope of the crisis undeniable. Elena continued her analysis, her mind automatically calculating distances, flight times, and fuel requirements with the precision that had made her one of the Navy's most effective mission coordinators. For aircraft assets, we have 4 V-22 Ospreys currently assigned to hurricane rescue operations. Maximum range in helicopter mode is approximately 300 nautical miles with useful load, but that's under ideal conditions. Hurricane winds will significantly increase fuel consumption, and the need to maintain station over platforms for extended periods during multi-trip extractions will further reduce operational radius. Elena pulled up a map showing platform locations relative to potential launch points, overlaying fuel consumption estimates and flight time calculations. The picture that emerged was mathematically stark. If we assume each Osprey can conduct 3 round trips to deep water platforms before requiring refueling, and estimate 15 minutes of station time per trip for passenger loading, each aircraft can extract approximately 36 people per mission cycle. 4 aircraft operating at maximum efficiency could theoretically extract 144 people per complete mission cycle. The implications of her calculations hit Elena like a physical blow. Admiral, even operating at 100% efficiency with no mechanical problems, no weather delays, and no complications during extraction operations, We would need almost 5 complete mission cycles to evacuate all deep-water platform personnel. At current weather deterioration rates, we might have time for 2 cycles before conditions become completely unmanageable. Elena stared at the numbers on her screen, feeling the weight of mathematical inevitability pressing down on her like the storm bearing down on the Gulf Coast. We're looking at potentially 400 to 500 people who cannot be reached using conventional rescue methods. Even if every extraction goes perfectly according to plan, we don't have enough aircraft or time to save everyone. Admiral Montgomery's response came after a long pause, her voice carrying the flat affect that senior officers adopted when discussing casualty projections. Elena, your analysis confirms what our operational planning staff concluded 2 hours ago. This is going to be a triage situation. We're going to have to make decisions about which platforms receive priority for rescue operations and which personnel may be asked to shelter in place and wait for post-storm recovery operations. The euphemism didn't hide the brutal reality of what Admiral Montgomery was describing. Shelter in place meant that some people would be left on offshore platforms during a direct hit from a Category 4 hurricane, with the hope that they could survive until rescue operations could resume after the storm passed. Elena had coordinated enough post-hurricane operations to know that post-storm recovery often meant body recovery rather than live rescue. Admiral, what criteria are being used to prioritize rescue operations? Platform structural integrity, personnel count, and accessibility given current weather conditions. Deep Horizon 7 represents the worst-case scenario, highest personnel count, most severe structural damage, and greatest distance from shore-based rescue assets. Ironically, it's also the platform that would require the most dangerous rescue operation to reach. Elena understood the tactical logic, but her mind was already working through alternative scenarios, searching for solutions that might improve the mathematics of survival. Ma'am, what if we modified the extraction parameters? Instead of bringing people all the way back to shore-based facilities, could we transfer them to platforms that are outside the hurricane's track? Some of the installations in the eastern Gulf might be experiencing manageable weather conditions, even while the western platforms are getting the full force of the storm. Admiral Montgomery's interest was audible in her response. Explain your thinking. Elena pulled up a broader map showing all Gulf Coast installations and their positions relative to Hurricane Beatrice's projected track. Titan Industries platform. Echo is approximately 80 nautical miles southeast of Deep Horizon 7, and it appears to be just outside the hurricane's cone of uncertainty. If Beatrice maintains its current track, Echo might experience tropical storm conditions but not hurricane-force winds. Platform Echo has capacity for an additional 200 personnel in emergency shelter configurations. Elena's fingers moved rapidly across her console as she calculated new flight profiles. Using Platform Echo as an intermediate staging area would reduce round-trip flight times by 60% and allow aircraft to operate in marginally safer weather conditions during the return leg of each mission. Instead of 3-hour round trips to shore, we could conduct 90-minute transfers to Echo, allowing each aircraft to complete significantly more extraction cycles. Admiral Montgomery was quiet for several seconds, and Elena could hear the sound of rapid conversation in the background as the Admiral shared this analysis with her operational staff. Elena, you just identified a possibility that our mission planning team missed completely. They were so focused on shore-based extraction protocols that they didn't consider intermediate staging options. Elena felt a familiar surge of the analytical satisfaction that had always driven her approach to complex problems. This was exactly the kind of multivariable optimization that her mind naturally gravitated toward, the type of unconventional thinking that had consistently gotten her in trouble during flight training but made her invaluable as a communications coordinator. The staging approach doesn't solve the fundamental problem of Deep Horizon 7, Elena continued, her mind now fully engaged with the logistical puzzle. Even with reduced flight times, that platform would still require multiple extraction flights in the most dangerous weather conditions. But it might make the difference between saving 400 people and saving 600 people from the other platforms. Admiral Montgomery's response carried a new note of urgency. Elena, I need you to understand something. The scenario you've just outlined using Platform Echo as an intermediate staging area is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that this crisis requires. But it also means that the Deep Horizon 7 mission becomes even more critical to the overall operation. Elena felt her stomach tighten as she realized the implications. Because Deep Horizon 7 has the highest personnel count and represents the most dangerous extraction. Exactly. If we can successfully extract the 127 people from Deep Horizon 7 and use your staging approach for the other platforms, we might be able to save everyone. But if the Deep Horizon 7 mission fails, we lose not just those 127 lives, but also one of our 4 aircraft and crews, reducing our capacity for the other rescue operations. Elena stared at her computer screen, where the mathematical realities of the crisis were laid out in stark digital precision. Hurricane Beatrice's track was unwavering, its intensity was still increasing, and the operational window for rescue operations was closing with each passing hour. In 10 hours, the storm's eye wall would pass directly over Deep Horizon 7, bringing sustained winds of over 150 knots and wave heights exceeding 50 feet. Admiral, you're telling me that the success or failure of the entire operation may depend on whether someone can successfully fly a single V-22 into the center of a Category 4 hurricane, conduct multiple precision extractions from a damaged platform, and return safely through conditions that killed 2 experienced pilots in a much less severe storm. That's exactly what I'm telling you, Elena, and I'm telling you that based on your analysis of alternative staging approaches and your understanding of the operational complexities involved, you might be the person best equipped to see solutions that others are missing. Elena looked out at Hurricane Beatrice's approaching fury, watching debris fly past the communication center's reinforced windows with increasing frequency. Somewhere in that maelstrom of wind and rain, 127 people were trapped on a damaged platform, counting on rescue operations that every experienced pilot considered impossible. But Elena's mind was no longer focused on the impossibility of the mission. It was beginning to work through the technical challenges of making the impossible merely very dangerous. Admiral Montgomery's voice took on a different quality, the formal military precision, giving way to something more personal, more urgent. Elena, I need you to forget everything you've been told about what makes a good pilot. Forget the flight school evaluations. Forget the standardized procedures. Forget every instructor who told you that following the manual was more important than achieving the mission. Elena felt a shift in her thinking, as if mental barriers that had constrained her for months were beginning to crack. Through the storm-battered windows of the communications center, she could see the true fury of Hurricane Beatrice beginning to assert itself, but for the first time since receiving her 3rd flight training dismissal, she wasn't focused on her limitations. Instead, her mind was analyzing the technical challenges of the Deep Horizon 7 mission with the same systematic approach she had always applied to complex communication operations. Ma'am, when I was coordinating the Majestic Voyager rescue during Hurricane Ezra, I guided 37 aircraft through conditions that grounded all commercial aviation. The pilots kept telling me that their instruments were giving them conflicting information, that they couldn't maintain orientation, that the weather was beyond their aircraft's capabilities. But from my position coordinating the operation, I could see patterns in the storm that individual pilots couldn't detect from inside their aircraft. Admiral Montgomery's response was immediate. Tell me about those patterns. Elena pulled up archived weather data from the Majestic Voyager incident, her fingers automatically navigating to files she had reviewed dozens of times while writing post-operation analyses. Hurricane Ezra had a very defined eye wall structure, but the storm was interacting with a strong upper-level wind shear that created predictable zones of relative calm within the overall chaos. By tracking radar returns and correlating them with pilot reports, I could identify corridors where aircraft could operate safely even when the surrounding weather was completely unmanageable. Elena's voice gained confidence as she continued. The key was understanding that hurricanes aren't uniformly violent. They have internal structure, predictable patterns of air movement, zones where the rules change. Most pilots were trying to fly through the storm by avoiding the worst weather, but I realized that the most effective approach was to use the storm's own energy patterns to provide lift and stability. Admiral Montgomery was quiet for a moment, and Elena could hear the sound of computer keyboards and urgent conversations in the background. "Elena, you just described something that our meteorological staff calls hurricane exploitation flying, using the storm's internal dynamics to assist aircraft performance rather than fighting against them. It's a theoretical concept that very few pilots have ever attempted in practice." Elena felt her pulse quicken as she realized that her instinctive understanding of storm patterns had an actual name, an established theoretical framework that validated approaches she had developed through pure operational necessity. "Admiral, during the majestic Voyager operation, I guided Coast Guard helicopters through what the pilots described as impossible approaches by having them follow specific headings that used the hurricane circulation patterns to provide additional lift and stability. Instead of fighting the storm, they were riding it. And this worked perfectly. We extracted 412 people in conditions that meteorologists said should have grounded all aircraft. The pilots thought I was some kind of genius, but I was just applying the same pattern recognition I use for managing complex radio networks. Storms have communication signatures just like electronic systems. You can read their behavior if you know what to look for." Admiral Montgomery's excitement was audible in her voice. "Elena, what you're describing is exactly why conventional flight training failed you. You don't think like a pilot who follows procedures. You think like an analyst who solves problems. The military has been trying to teach you to fly by the book, but what this mission needs is someone who can write a new book in real time." Elena stood and began pacing the communications center, her mind now fully engaged with the technical possibilities rather than the procedural limitations. "Admiral, if I were to attempt the Deep Horizon 7 mission, I wouldn't approach it like a standard rescue operation. I'd treat it like a complex systems problem that requires real-time optimization of multiple variables." Elena pulled up her weather analysis workstation, the same sophisticated setup she used for coordinating major rescue operations. The V-22's unique flight characteristics actually make it ideal for hurricane operations if you abandon conventional flying techniques. In helicopter mode, you can use the storm's updrafts and downdrafts to maintain position with much less power than standard hovering would require. In airplane mode, you can achieve much higher speeds by riding the hurricane's circulation rather than fighting against it. Admiral Montgomery's response came quickly. "Our flight manuals specifically prohibit using external wind patterns for lift assistance during precision operations. Your flight manuals were written for normal weather conditions," Elena replied, her voice gaining the authoritative tone she used when coordinating complex operations. "They assume that external wind is a hazard to be avoided rather than a resource to be exploited. But in hurricane conditions, fighting the wind is what kills." Pilots Hayes and Kim died because they tried to maintain standard flight profiles in non-standard conditions. Elena pulled up the technical specifications for the V-22 Osprey, cross-referencing them with her analysis of Hurricane Beatrice's internal structure. The Osprey's computer-controlled flight systems are designed to maintain stability in extreme conditions, but only if the pilot understands how to work with the aircraft's automated responses rather than overriding them. Most pilots are trained to maintain manual control authority, but in hurricane conditions, the aircraft's computers can actually process environmental data faster than human reflexes can respond. Admiral Montgomery was quiet for several seconds, and Elena could hear animated discussion in the background. Elena, you're describing flight techniques that aren't taught in any Navy training program. Because Navy training programs are designed to produce consistent, predictable results under normal conditions. But Deep Horizon 7 isn't a normal condition. It's an emergency that requires improvisation, adaptation, and the willingness to try approaches that have never been tested. Elena felt a familiar surge of confidence, the same feeling she experienced when coordinating complex rescue operations that seemed impossible until she found the right combination of aircraft, timing, and approach techniques. Admiral, I've been thinking about this wrong. I've been trying to become the kind of pilot that the Navy wants, someone who follows procedures and maintains standard safety margins. But what this mission needs is exactly the kind of pilot that flight training programs are designed to eliminate. Admiral Montgomery's laugh was sharp and genuine. Elena, you just articulated something that the Navy has been struggling with for decades. Our training programs are optimized for peacetime operations, but our mission requirements increasingly demand wartime thinking. We need pilots who can innovate under pressure, but we train pilots who excel at maintaining consistency. Elena looked out at Hurricane Beatrice's approaching fury, but instead of seeing an impossible obstacle, she was beginning to see patterns of opportunity. Ma'am, I think I've been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking whether I can fly a V-22 according to established procedures, I should be asking whether I can develop new procedures that accomplish the mission in conditions that existing procedures can't handle. Admiral Montgomery's response carried a note of finality. Elena, that's exactly the question this mission requires. Not whether you can follow someone else's playbook, but whether you can write a new one. The people on Deep Horizon 7 don't need a pilot who can execute standard procedures. They need someone who can invent solutions that don't exist yet. Elena felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of her own capabilities. For 8 months, she had carried the weight of flight training failures as evidence of her inadequacy as a pilot. But Admiral Montgomery was suggesting that those failures weren't evidence of incompetence. They were evidence of a different kind of competence that conventional training programs couldn't recognize or develop. Admiral, if I accept this mission, I won't be flying it like any rescue operation that's ever been attempted before. Good, Admiral Montgomery replied without hesitation. Because no rescue operation like this has ever been successfully completed before. We need someone who can succeed where conventional approaches have failed, and that means someone who thinks differently about what's possible. Elena stared at her reflection in the storm-lashed window, but instead of seeing a failed pilot, she was beginning to see someone who might be uniquely qualified for an impossible mission. Ma'am, I have one more question. When you say that this mission requires someone who can write new procedures, are you giving me authorization to deviate from standard flight operations as necessary to complete the rescue? Admiral Montgomery's answer came without hesitation. Elena, I'm giving you authorization to do whatever it takes to bring those people home alive. The only procedure that matters is success. Elena stared at the storm tracking display for a long moment, watching Hurricane Beatrice's inexorable march toward the Gulf Coast platforms. The eye of the storm was now perfectly defined, a circular void of calm surrounded by walls of wind and rain that were registering sustained speeds of over 140 knots. In 8 hours, that eye would pass directly over Deep Horizon 7, bringing with it conditions that would make survival on the platform questionable and rescue operations seemingly impossible. But as Elena studied the storm's structure, she wasn't seeing impossibility anymore. Instead, Her mind was automatically cataloging the technical challenges and beginning to formulate solutions with the same systematic approach she had always applied to complex operational problems. The difference was that this time, instead of coordinating the mission from a safe distance, she would be flying into the heart of the hurricane herself. "Admiral," Elena said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to commit. "Teal, I'll take the mission." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, carrying with them the weight of 127 lives and the potential for either the most successful rescue operation in Navy history or a disaster that would claim even more lives. Elena felt a strange sense of calm settle over her, the same focused clarity she experienced when managing multiple aircraft during complex emergency operations. "Admiral." Montgomery's response was immediate, but carried an undertone of something that might have been relief. "Elena, I need you to understand that once you accept this mission, there's no turning back. Weather conditions are deteriorating too rapidly to allow for delays or second thoughts. If you're going to launch, it has to be within the next 2 hours." Elena pulled up the flight planning software on her workstation, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency across interfaces she had used hundreds of times to coordinate rescue operations. But this time, instead of planning routes for other pilots, she was calculating her own flight profile into conditions that would challenge every aspect of her technical knowledge and flying ability. "Ma'am, I'll need complete access to real-time weather data, including satellite imaging, radar returns, and atmospheric pressure readings. I'll also need direct communication with Deep Horizon 7 to coordinate approach timing and platform conditions." Admiral Montgomery's tone became crisp and businesslike. "You'll have priority access to all weather reconnaissance assets, including data from our Hurricane Hunter aircraft that are currently penetrating the storm. Platform communications are intermittent due to equipment damage, but we can maintain contact through emergency radio frequencies." Elena was already pulling up technical manuals for the V-22 Osprey, cross-referencing flight characteristics with the environmental conditions she would be facing. Her mind was operating in the analytical mode that had made her such an effective communications coordinator, breaking down complex problems into manageable components and identifying critical decision points. "Admiral, I'll need to modify standard approach procedures based on the platform's current condition and the storm's internal structure. What's the latest assessment of Deep Horizon 7's structural integrity?" Elena could hear papers rustling and computer keyboards clicking in the background as Admiral Montgomery accessed the most recent engineering reports. "The platform's main structure remains sound, but the helicopter landing deck has sustained significant damage from debris impact. The landing surface is rated for aircraft up to the Osprey's weight, but the approach will be complicated by damaged equipment and reduced available space." Elena pulled up architectural drawings of Deep Horizon 7, studying the platforms layout and identifying potential approach corridors that might provide some protection from the hurricane's winds. The platform was a massive structure, standing over 200 feet above the water on steel legs that extended down to the ocean floor. But its size also meant that it would create complex wind patterns that could make precise flying extremely difficult. "Ma'am, what's the personnel distribution on the platform? Are they concentrated in specific areas, or will I need to conduct extractions from multiple locations?" Admiral Montgomery's pause suggested that she was consulting additional reports. "Most personnel are sheltering in the platform's emergency safe room, which is located in the central structure about 50 feet below the helicopter deck. However, 12 people are trapped in a section of the platform that's partially flooded but structurally stable. They can't reach the main safe room due to blocked passages, but they're in no immediate danger as long as the platform remains intact." Elena understood immediately that this would complicate the rescue operation significantly. Instead of a single extraction point, She would need to conduct multiple pickups from different areas of the platform, each requiring precision flying. In hurricane conditions, while managing the complex transition between helicopter and airplane mode that made the V-22 so challenging to operate. Admiral, I'm going to need a crew chief who's experienced with hurricane operations and understands the V-22's cargo handling systems. The extraction process will require precise coordination between aircraft positioning and personnel movement, especially for the trapped workers. Admiral Montgomery's response came quickly. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos will be your crew chief. She has over 15 years of experience with V-22 operations and has conducted emergency extractions in extreme weather conditions. She's also qualified as an emergency medical technician, which may be important if any of the platform personnel require immediate medical attention. Elena felt a surge of confidence knowing that she would be working with an experienced crew member who understood both the aircraft's capabilities and the complexities of rescue operations. During her failed flight training programs, she had always performed better when working with crews who could anticipate her unconventional approaches and provide the kind of real-time feedback that made complex operations possible. Ma'am, what about escort aircraft or backup support? Admiral Montgomery's tone became more serious. Elena, you need to understand that this will be a solo mission. Weather conditions will prevent any other aircraft from operating in the same area, and our remaining V-22s will be conducting extraction operations at other platforms using your staging approach. Once you launch, you'll be completely on your own until you return to base. Elena absorbed this information without surprise. She had coordinated enough rescue operations to understand that hurricane conditions created communication blackouts and made formation flying impossibly dangerous. The Deep Horizon 7 mission would require the kind of independent decision-making and real-time problem-solving that had always come naturally to her. Admiral, I'll need authorization codes for emergency frequency usage and priority handling for any communications with shore-based facilities. If I encounter unexpected complications, I may need to coordinate with other rescue assets or request immediate weather updates. Admiral Montgomery provided the necessary codes and communication protocols, but Elena could hear an undertone of concern in her voice. Elena, I need you to promise me something. If conditions become unmanageable, if the mission profile exceeds what you consider survivable, you have my authorization to abort and return to base. Those 127 people need rescue, but the Navy also needs you to survive to participate in other rescue operations. Elena understood the implication. She was being given permission to make the ultimate command decision about risk versus probability of success, the kind of judgment call that could save lives or cost them, depending on how accurately she assessed the rapidly changing conditions she would face. Ma'am, I understand. But I also need you to understand that once I launch, I'm committed to bringing those people home. I won't abort unless continuation of the mission would guarantee failure. Admiral Montgomery was quiet for several seconds, and Elena could sense the weight of command responsibility in that silence. Elena, in 30 minutes you need to report to Hangar 7 for aircraft preparation and final mission briefing. Chief Santos is already conducting pre-flight checks on Osprey 6-2 Alpha. Your weather window opens in 90 minutes, and conditions after that will be beyond the operational envelope for any aircraft. Elena stood up from her communications console, taking one last look at the displays that had been her professional home for 6 years. Hurricane Beatrice continued its relentless advance toward the Gulf Coast, its eye wall now clearly visible on satellite imagery as a perfect circle of destruction, surrounded by bands of rain and wind stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. But Elena was no longer afraid of the storm. Instead, she found herself anticipating the technical challenge of flying through conditions that would test every aspect of her analytical abilities and flying skills. For the first time since her flight training failures, she felt like she was about to do exactly what she was meant to do. Admiral, one last question. After this mission, assuming I succeed, what happens to my status as a pilot? Admiral Montgomery's laugh was genuine and warm. Elena, if you successfully extract 127 people from an offshore platform during a direct hit from a Category 4 hurricane, I think the Navy can overlook your difficulty with standardized training procedures. You'll probably find yourself writing new training manuals instead of trying to follow old ones. Elena smiled for the first time in months. Ma'am, I'll see you after the mission. Vasquez out. As she ended the call and began gathering her flight gear, Elena realized that she was no longer the communications officer who had failed flight training 3 times. She was about to become the pilot who would attempt something that had never been done before, flying into the heart of a hurricane to save people that everyone else had written off as unreachable. The storm was waiting, and so were 127 people who were counting on her to succeed where conventional thinking said success was impossible. Elena stepped into Hangar 7 and immediately felt the difference in atmospheric pressure as Hurricane Beatrice's outer bands reached Naval Air Station Meridian Falls. The massive steel doors were sealed against the storm, but she could hear the wind howling outside with a fury that made the building's framework groan under the assault. In the center of the hangar, Osprey 62 Alpha sat like a sleeping predator, its twin rotors folded back along the aircraft's wings in airplane configuration. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos looked up from her pre-flight checklist as Elena approached, her weathered face showing the kind of calm competence that came from years of high-stakes operations. Lieutenant Commander Vasquez, I'm Chief Santos. I have to say, ma'am, this is either going to be the most incredible rescue mission in Navy history or the shortest flight of your career. Elena felt a surge of appreciation for Santos's direct approach. After months of instructors who seemed determined to cushion every criticism in layers of diplomatic language, working with someone who spoke plainly about the realities they were facing felt refreshing. Chief, what's the aircraft status? Santos gestured toward the Osprey with obvious pride in her voice. 62 Alpha is our newest bird, equipped with the latest weather radar and enhanced flight control computers. She's been modified specifically for extreme weather operations, with reinforced landing gear, upgraded engine particle separators, and redundant hydraulic systems. If any Osprey can survive what we're about to attempt, it's this one. Elena walked around the aircraft, her trained eye automatically cataloging the modifications that Santos had mentioned. The Osprey looked more robust than the training aircraft she remembered from her failed program, with additional equipment pods and what appeared to be military-grade weather penetration gear mounted throughout the airframe. Chief, I need to be completely honest with you about something. My last V-22 flight was 8 months ago, and it ended with my removal from the training program for failure to follow standardized procedures. You're about to fly into a Category 4 hurricane with a pilot who's been officially designated as unqualified for V-22 operations. Santos's grin was fierce and genuine. Ma'am, with all due respect, standardized procedures are what get people killed in weather like this. I've flown with textbook pilots who couldn't adapt when conditions exceeded their training parameters. What I need is someone who can think on their feet and make decisions based on what's actually happening instead of what the manual says should be happening. Elena felt another barrier fall away as she realized that Santos understood exactly why she had been chosen for this mission. Chief, during our approach to Deep Horizon 7, I'm going to be using techniques that aren't in any Navy flight manual. I'll be working with the hurricane circulation patterns instead of fighting against them, and I'll be relying heavily on the aircraft's automated systems to manage stability while I focus on navigation and positioning. Santos nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. The V-22's flight computers are designed to handle conditions that would overwhelm human reflexes, but most pilots are trained to maintain manual override authority. In hurricane flying, the computers are your best friend, not your backup system. Elena climbed into the pilot's seat and immediately felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft's controls responding to her touch. But something was different this time. Instead of the anxiety and self-doubt that had plagued her during training flights, she felt a sense of focused anticipation, as if she were finally sitting in an aircraft that matched her analytical approach to flying. "Chief, I'm going to conduct a modified pre-flight sequence that incorporates real-time weather data integration. Instead of following the standard checklist, I want to establish data links with our weather reconnaissance assets and configure the aircraft systems for dynamic response to changing atmospheric conditions." Santos was already moving to establish the requested data connections, her movements showing the efficiency that came from years of emergency operations. "Ma'am, I'm linking you directly to Hurricane Hunter Alpha, which is currently penetrating Beatrice's eye wall about 50 miles south of Deep Horizon 7. You'll have real-time wind speed, pressure differentials, and turbulence data updated every 30 seconds. Elena's hands moved across the aircraft's complex control panel with increasing confidence as she integrated weather data streams with flight planning software. This was exactly the kind of multi-dimensional problem-solving that her mind naturally gravitated toward, the type of complex systems management that had made her such an effective communications coordinator. The hangar's communication system crackled to life with Admiral Montgomery's voice. "Osprey 62 Alpha, this is Admiral Montgomery. You are cleared for immediate launch. Deep Horizon 7 reports that platform conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and their emergency power systems are beginning to fail. Your weather window is now estimated at 60 minutes before conditions become completely unmanageable." Elena felt her pulse quicken, but not with anxiety. Instead, she experienced the same focused clarity that had always marked her best operational performances. "Admiral Montgomery, Osprey 62 Alpha copies. We are beginning engine start sequence and will be airborne in 5 minutes. Santos was already moving through the startup checklist with practiced efficiency, but Elena noticed that the chief was incorporating real-time atmospheric data into her calculations, adjusting power settings and system configurations to account for the extreme conditions they would be flying through. "Chief, I'm seeing some unusual pressure gradients in the latest weather data. Beatrice's eye wall is showing signs of rapid intensification, which means the internal wind patterns are going to be more complex than our initial planning assumed." Santos looked up from her instruments with obvious concern. "Ma'am, how does that change our approach profile?" Elena studied the incoming data streams, her mind automatically processing the three-dimensional picture of atmospheric conditions that was emerging from the Hurricane Hunter's reports. "It means we can't use standard approach techniques at all. The wind patterns around Deep Horizon 7 are going to be chaotic and unpredictable, but they're also going to create opportunities for aircraft control that wouldn't exist in normal weather." Elena's fingers flew across the flight computer's interface as she began programming approach scenarios that incorporated the hurricane's own circulation patterns. "Chief, I'm going to fly this mission like I coordinate rescue operations, by reading the storm's behavior in real time and adapting our techniques to work with the environment instead of against it." The Osprey's engines spooled up with the distinctive whine of turbines coming online, and Elena felt the aircraft's systems responding to her inputs with the kind of precision that had always impressed her during her brief training experience. But this time, instead of trying to fly according to someone else's procedures, she was developing her own techniques based on the specific conditions they would be facing. "Ma'am," Santos called over the engine noise, "I'm getting reports that other rescue aircraft have been grounded due to deteriorating weather. We're going to be the only asset capable of reaching Deep Horizon 7. Elena absorbed this information without surprise. She had coordinated enough hurricane operations to understand that conditions could deteriorate faster than forecast models predicted, often leaving rescue assets stranded on the ground while people died waiting for help that couldn't reach them. Chief, that just means we need to succeed on our first attempt. There won't be backup aircraft or second chances. Elena advanced the throttles and felt the Osprey respond with the smooth power delivery that made the aircraft so capable in extreme conditions. As the hangar doors opened to reveal the full fury of Hurricane Beatrice's approach, Elena realized that this was exactly what she had been training for throughout her entire career, even if she hadn't understood it at the time. Admiral Montgomery, Osprey 62 Alpha is ready for departure. Beginning takeoff sequence. Elena lifted the Osprey into the storm-lashed sky, immediately feeling the aircraft's response to the chaotic wind patterns that marked Hurricane Beatrice's outer circulation. But instead of fighting the turbulence, she found herself working with it, using the storm's own energy to assist the aircraft's climb toward Deep Horizon 7. Chief, we're not just flying into this hurricane, Elena called over the storm's fury. We're going to ride it all the way to the platform. As they climbed through the storm's violent atmosphere, Elena realized that her flight training failures had been preparing her for exactly this moment, a mission that required innovation instead of procedure, adaptation instead of standardization, and the courage to write new rules when the old ones proved inadequate for the challenges they faced. 20 minutes into the flight, Elena was learning to read Hurricane Beatrice like a three-dimensional map written in wind and rain. The Osprey bucked and rolled through atmospheric turbulence that would have grounded any conventional aircraft, but Elena found herself anticipating each wind shear and downdraft, using the storm's own energy patterns to maintain controlled flight. Toward Deep Horizon 7. Chief, I'm seeing pressure differentials that create natural corridors through the storm, Elena called over the hurricane's fury. Her voice was steady despite the fact that they were flying through conditions that measured wind speeds of over 100 knots with gusts exceeding 130. The hurricane circulation is creating zones of relative stability that we can use for navigation. Santos monitored her instruments with the calm efficiency of someone who had flown through dozens of major storms. Ma'am, your flight path is taking us through areas that our weather models said were unnavigable. How are you finding these corridors? Elena's answer came as she executed a turn that used Hurricane Beatrice's own circulation to assist the maneuver, reducing engine strain while maintaining their course toward the platform. I'm reading the storm's pressure signatures the same way I read radio frequency patterns during complex communications operations. Every hurricane has internal structure zones where different air masses interact in predictable ways. Elena pulled up the real-time weather data from Hurricane Hunter Alpha, overlaying it with their current position and flight path. The three-dimensional picture that emerged showed Hurricane Beatrice not as a uniform wall of destruction, but as a complex system with definable patterns of air movement that could be exploited by an aircraft with the right capabilities. Chief, watch this. Elena adjusted the Osprey's flight controls to align with a pressure gradient that the weather data indicated would provide additional lift. Immediately, the aircraft's climb rate increased while engine power requirements decreased, as if the hurricane itself were helping to carry them toward their destination. Santos's admiration was audible in her voice. Ma'am, I've never seen anyone fly hurricane conditions like this. You're making the storm work for us instead of against us. Elena felt a surge of confidence as she realized that her analytical approach to complex systems was translating perfectly to aircraft operation in extreme conditions. This was exactly the kind of multivariable problem-solving that her mind naturally gravitated toward, but applied to flight operations instead of communications coordination. Chief, we're approaching the first test zone. According to the weather data, we should encounter severe wind shear in about 30 seconds. I'm going to demonstrate how to use the Osprey's computer systems to maintain stability during rapid atmospheric transitions. Elena pre-positioned the aircraft's control surfaces and adjusted power settings based on the incoming weather data, then allowed the Osprey's flight computers to manage the micro-corrections necessary to maintain controlled flight as they entered the wind shear zone. The aircraft shuddered and bucked as it encountered conflicting air masses moving at different speeds and directions, but Elena's preparation allowed them to transit the turbulence with minimal altitude loss or course deviation. "Outstanding flying, ma'am," Santos called. Most pilots would have tried to fight their way through that manually and probably lost control. Elena was already analyzing the next section of their flight path, where Hurricane Hunter Alpha was, reporting even more severe atmospheric conditions. "Chief, the real test is coming up. We're about to enter the hurricane's eye wall, where wind speeds exceed 140 knots and atmospheric pressure changes can cause rapid altitude variations of over 1,000 feet. Elena pulled up the Osprey's advanced flight management system, configuring it for autonomous stability control while she focused on navigation and energy management. This was exactly the kind of human-computer collaboration that her flight instructors had discouraged. But Elena had realized that the aircraft's automated systems could process environmental data far faster than human reflexes could respond. "Ma'am, are you sure about letting the computer fly us through the eye wall?" Santos asked, her voice carrying a note of concern. Elena's response reflected the confidence that came from understanding both the aircraft's capabilities and the storm's behavior. "Chief, in conditions like this, human reflexes are too slow to maintain aircraft control. The computer can make 100 control adjustments per second based on sensor data, while I can maybe make 10 adjustments per second based on what I can see and feel. My job is to manage the big picture while the computer handles the details." As they approached the eye wall, Elena felt the Osprey encounter atmospheric violence that exceeded anything she had experienced during her training flights. The aircraft was thrown around like a toy, gaining and losing hundreds of feet of altitude in seconds as it encountered massive updrafts and downdrafts. But instead of fighting the turbulence, Elena had programmed the flight computers to ride the vertical air currents, using the hurricane's energy to maintain forward progress toward Deep Horizon 7. "Chief, we're about to break through into the eye of the hurricane. Conditions should become much calmer, but we'll only have about 20 minutes before we need to penetrate the eye wall again to reach the platform." Elena was proven correct. As the Osprey suddenly emerged into the eerie calm of Hurricane Beatrice's eye, the transition was dramatic from violent turbulence and zero visibility to relatively smooth air and clear skies that allowed them to see the storm's massive walls rising around them like the inside of an enormous cylinder. "Jesus," Santos breathed, staring up at the eye wall that surrounded them. "I've never seen anything like this." Elena took advantage of the calmer conditions to conduct a comprehensive systems check and update their navigation based on the latest position data from Deep Horizon 7. The platform was now visible on their weather radar, a small electronic signature, surrounded by the chaotic atmospheric returns that marked the hurricane's continued intensification. "Chief, Deep Horizon 7 reports that they're experiencing sustained winds of over 120 knots, with gusts exceeding 150. The platform is holding together structurally, but their emergency power systems are failing, and they're starting to lose communication capability." Elena studied the radar signature of the platform and the surrounding atmospheric conditions, beginning to formulate an approach strategy that would allow them to conduct precision extractions in winds that exceeded the Osprey's published operational limitations. "Ma'am, how are we going to maintain hover over the platform in those wind conditions?" Santos asked. Elena's answer reflected hours of study and analysis that she had compressed into minutes of real-time problem solving. "We're not going to hover in the traditional sense. I'm going to use the platform structure to create wind, shadows and pressure differentials that will allow us to maintain position while conducting rapid extractions. Elena pulled up architectural drawings of Deep Horizon 7, identifying approach corridors that would provide some protection from the hurricane's winds, while allowing access to the platform's damaged helicopter deck. The approach would require precision flying that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits, but Elena found herself looking forward to the technical challenge rather than dreading it. Chief, I'm going to demonstrate something that's never been attempted before using a hurricane circulation patterns to assist precision approach flying. Instead of fighting our way to the platform, we're going to let the storm carry us there. Elena began configuring the Osprey systems for the transition from eye-wall transit to precision approach flying, integrating real-time atmospheric data with the aircraft's navigation computers to create a flight profile that would use Hurricane Beatrice's own energy to position them over Deep Horizon 7. "Ma'am," Santos said, her voice reflecting growing respect for Elena's unconventional techniques, "if this works, you're going to revolutionize how the Navy conducts extreme weather operations." Elena smiled as she prepared for the most challenging approach of her career. "Chief, if this works, we're going to save 127 people who everyone else wrote off as unreachable. And if it doesn't work, no one will be around to criticize our techniques." As they prepared to exit the eye and begin their approach to Deep Horizon 7, Elena realized that every failed training flight, every dismissed procedure, and every criticism of her unconventional thinking had been preparing her for exactly this moment. She was no longer trying to become the kind of pilot that the Navy wanted. She was becoming the kind of pilot that this mission required. The approach to Deep Horizon 7 began as Elena guided the Osprey out of the hurricane's eye and back into the screaming fury of the eye wall. But this time, instead of the chaotic violence they had experienced during their initial penetration, Elena was flying with purpose and precision, using every lesson she had learned about Hurricane Beatrice's internal structure to position the aircraft for what would be the most technically demanding rescue operation ever attempted. "Chief, I'm reading wind speeds of 165 knots, sustained with gusts exceeding 180. Elena called over the storm's fury as they approached the platform's coordinates. "These are Category 5 conditions, well beyond anything the Osprey was designed to handle." Santos monitored her instruments with focused intensity, but Elena could hear admiration in her voice. "Ma'am, according to everything I know about aircraft limitations, we shouldn't be able to maintain controlled flight in these conditions. What you're doing is supposed to be impossible." Elena's response came as she executed a complex series of control inputs that used the hurricane's circulation patterns to maintain their approach vector, despite winds that should have torn the aircraft apart. "Chief, impossible is just another word for not in the manual. We're about to prove that the V-22 can do things that its designers never imagined." Through the storm-lashed windscreen, Deep Horizon 7 finally became visible as a massive steel structure rising from the churning ocean like a fortress under siege. The platform was being hammered by waves that measured over 60 feet in height, and Elena could see that significant portions of the helicopter deck had been damaged by debris and the sheer force of the hurricane's assault. But as Elena studied the platform's configuration, her analytical mind immediately began identifying opportunities rather than obstacles. The platform's massive superstructure was creating complex wind patterns that included zones of relative calm where precise flying might be possible, even in the midst of Hurricane Beatrice's fury. "Chief, I'm seeing 3 potential approach corridors, but they're all going to require flight techniques that aren't in any training manual," Elena announced, her voice steady despite the violence of the conditions surrounding them. "I'm going to need to transition between helicopter and airplane mode multiple times during the approach, using the platform structure to provide wind breaks while conducting rapid extractions." Elena pulled up her communication system and established contact with Deep Horizon 7's emergency coordinator. The radio signal was weak and distorted by atmospheric interference, but she could make out the desperate voice of Platform Chief Daniel Morrison. Navy Rescue Aircraft, this is Morrison on Deep Horizon 7. We have 115 personnel in the main safe room and 12 trapped in Section C7. Our emergency power is failing, and we're starting to lose structural integrity on the outer platforms. How soon can you begin extractions? Elena studied the platform through her weather radar and visual observation, calculating extraction sequences and flight profiles in real time. Deep Horizon 7, this is Osprey 62 Alpha. I'm going to begin extractions immediately, but the weather conditions require non-standard approach techniques. I need you to coordinate personnel movement to extraction points based on my instructions, not standard evacuation procedures. Elena began her first approach to the platform, using a flight profile that incorporated elements of both helicopter and airplane flying as she navigated through the complex wind patterns created by the platform's superstructure. The approach required split-second timing and precise control inputs as she transitioned between flight modes while fighting winds that exceeded the aircraft's design limitations. Chief, I'm going to demonstrate something that's never been attempted, Elena called as she positioned the Osprey for the first extraction. I'm going to use the Hurricane's downdrafts to assist our descent, then transition to helicopter mode in the wind shadow created by the platform's central structure. The maneuver required Elena to dive the Osprey through a massive downdraft at nearly 200 knots, then execute a rapid transition to helicopter mode while using the platform's steel framework to break the Hurricane's winds. It was a technique that violated every safety protocol ever written for V-22 operations, but it worked perfectly, allowing Elena to establish a stable hover just 20 feet above the platform's damaged helicopter deck. Outstanding flying, ma'am, Santos called as she prepared the hoist system for the first group of evacuees. But the platform is moving too much for a safe hoist operation. The deck is rising and falling over 15 feet with each wave. Elena had anticipated this problem and had already formulated a solution. Chief, I'm not going to maintain a fixed hover. I'm going to match the platform's movement using the aircraft's flight computers, essentially flying formation with a moving oil platform in hurricane conditions. The technique required Elena to constantly adjust the Osprey's position and altitude to match the platform's movement as it was hammered by massive waves. The flight computers helped by processing sensor data faster than human reflexes could respond, but Elena had to provide the strategic thinking that allowed the aircraft to anticipate the platform's motion patterns. Over the next 45 minutes, Elena conducted 7 separate approaches to different areas of Deep Horizon 7, each one requiring different techniques as she adapted to changing wind conditions and platform accessibility. She extracted personnel from the main safe room, the trapped workers in Section C7, and even conducted a daring rescue of 3 maintenance workers who had been isolated on the platform's outer framework. But as Elena prepared for the final extraction, Hurricane Beatrice delivered its ultimate challenge. The storm's eye wall began to contract rapidly, a phenomenon known as an eye wall replacement cycle that temporarily increased wind speeds to levels that exceeded Category 5 classification. Ma'am, we're now reading sustained winds of 190 knots with gusts over 220, Santos reported, her voice tight with concern. These are the strongest winds ever recorded in a hurricane, and we still have 12 people on the platform. Elena felt the Osprey struggling against atmospheric forces that pushed the aircraft beyond its design envelope, but her mind was already working through solutions. Chief, conventional approach techniques won't work in these conditions. I'm going to have to try something that's completely theoretical. Elena pulled up her most advanced weather analysis software, studying the 3-dimensional structure of the hurricane's circulation in real time. What she discovered was a narrow corridor of slightly less violent air that existed within the eye wall itself, a zone where the hurricane's circulation created a temporary reduction in wind speed that lasted for only minutes at a time. "Chief, I'm going to fly directly through the eye wall to reach the platform, using a pressure corridor that exists only because of the hurricane's current configuration. If my calculations are wrong, this technique will probably kill us. If I'm right, we might be able to conduct the final extraction." Elena began the most dangerous approach of her career, flying the Osprey through the heart of Hurricane Beatrice's eye wall while using atmospheric pressure differentials that existed for only seconds at a time. The technique required perfect timing and absolute precision as she navigated through wind speeds that no aircraft had ever survived. "Ma'am, the platform reports that their main structure is beginning to show stress fractures," Santos called. "If we don't get those last 12 people off within the next 10 minutes, the platform may collapse completely." Elena positioned the Osprey for the final approach, knowing that this extraction would either complete the most successful rescue mission in Navy history or end in disaster that would claim additional lives. As she prepared for the approach that would test every technique she had developed, Elena realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for throughout her entire career. "Chief, this is what we came here to do," Elena called over Hurricane Beatrice's fury. "Let's bring those people home." The final approach began as Elena flew the Osprey into atmospheric conditions that exceeded every limitation ever established for aircraft operations. Guided only by her understanding of the hurricane's internal dynamics and her confidence in techniques that existed nowhere except in her own mind, Elena committed the Osprey to the final approach through Hurricane Beatrice's eye wall, flying into atmospheric conditions that no aircraft had ever survived, guided by pressure differentials that existed for mere seconds and wind patterns that defied every principle of conventional aviation. The Osprey shuddered and bucked as it encountered the hurricane's full fury, but Elena's hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon, making micro-adjustments that kept the aircraft controllable in winds that measured over 220 knots. "Chief, I'm reading pressure drops that indicate we're encountering the absolute core of the hurricane," Elena called over the deafening roar of wind and engines. "The atmospheric forces we're experiencing right now are beyond anything ever recorded in aviation history." Santos watched her instruments with fascination rather than fear, understanding that she was witnessing flying techniques that were being invented in real time. "Ma'am, according to every structural limitation chart I've ever seen, the aircraft should have broken apart 5 minutes ago. What you're doing isn't just impossible, it's rewriting the laws of physics." Elena's response came as she executed a maneuver that used the hurricane's own circulation to provide additional lift while simultaneously reducing the structural stresses on the Osprey's airframe. "Chief, physics doesn't change, but our understanding of how to work with natural forces can evolve. I'm not fighting Hurricane Beatrice, I'm dancing with it." Through the chaos of the eye wall, Deep Horizon 7's damaged helicopter deck became visible again, but Elena could see immediately that the platform's condition had deteriorated significantly during their brief absence. Large sections of the outer framework were now underwater during wave peaks, and the main structure was showing visible stress fractures that suggested imminent collapse. "Deep Horizon 7, this is Osprey 62 Alpha beginning final approach," Elena transmitted over the emergency frequency. "I need those 12 personnel positioned at the extraction point immediately. Platform structural integrity appears critical, and we may have only one opportunity for extraction." Platform Chief Morrison's response crackled through heavy static. "Osprey 62 Alpha, personnel are ready for extraction, but our deck is now moving vertically over 25 feet with each wave cycle. I don't see how you can maintain position for hoist operations." Elena studied the platform's movement patterns through her radar and visual observation. her analytical mind automatically calculating the complex three-dimensional motion that resulted from the interaction between massive waves and the platform's steel framework. What she discovered was that the platform's movement, while extreme, followed predictable patterns that could be anticipated and compensated for using the Osprey's advanced flight control systems. "Chief, I'm going to attempt something that's never been tried before," Elena announced as she positioned the aircraft for the final extraction. "I'm going to synchronize the Osprey's flight path with the platform's wave-induced motion, essentially flying formation with a moving target while maintaining precise positioning for hoist operations." The technique required Elena to predict the platform's position several seconds in advance, then fly the Osprey through a complex three-dimensional flight path that would place the aircraft in the correct position at exactly the moment when the platform reached the optimal extraction point. It was mathematical flying at its most demanding, requiring split-second timing and perfect understanding of both aircraft performance and ocean dynamics. Elena began the extraction sequence, diving the Osprey through a massive downdraft while simultaneously transitioning to helicopter mode, using the platform's superstructure to break the hurricane's winds, while matching the vertical motion caused by 60-foot waves. The technique required her to make control inputs that seemed contradictory, climbing while descending, turning while flying straight, accelerating while decelerating, as she used Hurricane Beatrice's own energy patterns to position the aircraft precisely where it needed to be. "Hoist is going down," Santos called as she began lowering the rescue basket toward the platform. "But ma'am, the winds are creating basket oscillations that could injure the evacuees. How do we maintain stability during personnel transfer?" Elena had anticipated this problem and had already formulated a solution that incorporated lessons learned from her years of coordinating complex rescue operations. "Chief, I'm going to use the aircraft's downwash to create a localized wind pattern that will stabilize the basket. It requires precise power management, but the technique should reduce oscillations to manageable levels." Elena adjusted the Osprey's power settings and rotor pitch to create a controlled downwash pattern that effectively created a zone of relative calm directly beneath the aircraft. The technique worked perfectly, allowing Santos to conduct rapid but safe personnel transfers while Elena maintained impossible precision, positioning in conditions that exceeded every limitation ever established for aircraft operations. "First group of 4 is aboard," Santos reported as she brought the rescue basket up through the Osprey's controlled downwash zone. 8 more to go, but ma'am, the platform is showing more stress fractures. I don't think it's going to survive much longer." Elena could see the structural damage developing in real time as Hurricane Beatrice's assault continued to intensify. Large sections of the platform's framework were beginning to buckle under the combined assault of wind and waves, and she realized that they had perhaps 5 more minutes before catastrophic failure made any rescue attempt impossible. "Chief, we're going to accelerate the extraction sequence. I'm going to maintain position while you conduct rapid transfers. Instead of bringing people up 4 at a time, we're going to risk maximum capacity transfers." Elena held the Osprey in position while Santos conducted the fastest rescue hoist operations of her career, bringing up the remaining 8 platform personnel in 2 groups of 4, while Elena compensated for platform movement that was becoming increasingly erratic as structural damage weakened the platform stability. "Last group is coming up now," Santos called as she operated the hoist with practiced efficiency. 4 more people, and we're done." Elena felt the Osprey struggling against atmospheric forces that were pushing both aircraft and pilot beyond their absolute limits. Her hands cramped from maintaining precise control inputs for over an hour, and she could feel the aircraft systems being taxed by demands that exceeded their design specifications. But as the final 4 evacuees reached the safety of the Osprey's cabin, Elena experienced a surge of satisfaction that exceeded anything she had ever felt during her communications career. "All personnel aboard," Santos announced. 127 souls extracted successfully. "Ma'am, you just completed what's going to go down as the most impossible rescue mission in aviation history." Elena began the departure sequence, using Hurricane Beatrice's circulation patterns one final time to accelerate their escape from Deep Horizon 7. As they climbed away from the platform, Elena watched through her rear-facing cameras as the structure that had housed 127 people finally succumbed to the hurricane's assault, collapsing into the churning ocean in a cascade of twisted steel and debris. "Chief, if we had been 30 seconds later, those last 4 people would have gone down with the platform," Elena observed, her voice reflecting the calm satisfaction of someone who had just completed the most challenging mission of their career. Santos's response carried obvious admiration and respect. "Ma'am, what you accomplished today isn't just exceptional flying. It's a complete revolution in how we think about aircraft capabilities and pilot training. You prove that innovation and adaptation can achieve results that conventional procedures can't even attempt." As they flew back through Hurricane Beatrice's eye toward the safety of Naval Air Station Meridian Falls, Elena realized that she was no longer the communications officer who had failed 3 flight training programs. She had become something entirely new, a pilot who could succeed in conditions where conventional training and standardized procedures proved inadequate. Someone who could write new rules when the old rules failed to address the complexity of real-world emergencies. "Chief," Elena said as they established contact with Admiral Montgomery's staff to report mission completion, "I finally understand what I was meant to do with my career. This is exactly where I belong." The flight back to base was smooth compared to the violence they had just survived, but Elena knew that Hurricane Beatrice had changed her forever. She was no longer trying to fit into someone else's definition of what a pilot should be. She had discovered what she could become when her analytical mind was applied to challenges that demanded innovation rather than conformity. 6 months later, Commander Elena Vasquez stood in front of a classroom filled with Navy's most experienced pilots, watching their faces as she began her presentation on extreme weather flight operations. The promotion had come through 3 weeks after Hurricane Beatrice, along with assignments that represented a complete transformation of her career trajectory. But what satisfied Elena most was not the recognition or advancement. It was the opportunity to share techniques that could save lives in situations where conventional training proved inadequate. Extreme weather flying isn't about exceptional piloting skills, Elena told the assembled aviators, her voice carrying the authority that came from having successfully completed missions that others considered impossible. "It's about understanding that aircraft and atmospheric systems can work together in ways that aren't covered in any manual you've studied." Elena pulled up a 3-dimensional weather visualization showing Hurricane Beatrice's internal structure. The same data she had used to navigate through conditions that had killed experienced pilots in less severe storms. But instead of the chaotic maelstrom that most pilots saw when looking at hurricane imagery, Elena's analysis revealed patterns and opportunities that could be exploited by someone who understood the physics of storm dynamics. Traditional flight training teaches you to avoid severe weather, to maintain safe distances from thunderstorms and hurricanes, to land and wait for conditions to improve, Elena continued, watching as several pilots in the front row took notes. With the intensity of students who recognized that they were learning techniques that could determine survival in emergency situations. But in rescue operations, avoidance isn't always an option. Sometimes people are trapped in conditions where waiting for the weather to improve means watching them die. When that happens, you need to understand how to work with atmospheric forces instead of fighting against them. Elena activated a flight simulator that had been specifically configured to replicate the conditions she had encountered during the Deep Horizon 7 mission. The simulation was based on actual weather data from Hurricane Beatrice, creating a training environment that allowed pilots to experience extreme weather flying without the risks that had claimed previous rescue crews. Lieutenant Commander Torres, you have 3,000 hours of flight time in the V-22 Osprey and have conducted rescue operations in every major storm system that's hit the Gulf Coast in the past 5 years, Elena called to a pilot in the second row. I want you to attempt an approach to a simulated offshore platform using standard procedures for severe weather operations. Torres moved to the simulator controls with the confidence of someone who had successfully completed dozens of challenging rescue missions. Elena watched as he executed textbook approaches that demonstrated perfect adherence to established safety protocols, managing aircraft systems with the precision that had made him one of the Navy's most respected rescue pilots. But as the simulation progressed into hurricane conditions that replicated Elena's actual flight environment, Torres's conventional techniques began to fail. The simulated aircraft encountered wind shear that overwhelmed standard control responses, atmospheric turbulence that exceeded the effectiveness of manual flight control, and pressure differentials that made conventional approach patterns impossible to maintain. "I'm losing control authority," Torres reported, his voice reflecting the frustration of a skilled pilot encountering conditions that exceeded his training parameters. "Wind speeds are beyond aircraft limitations, and I can't maintain stable flight using standard procedures." Elena moved to the simulator controls, her hands automatically moving to flight management systems that most pilots used only as backup to manual control. "Lieutenant Commander, you're fighting the hurricane instead of working with it. Watch what happens when we use the storm's own energy to assist aircraft performance." Elena demonstrated the techniques she had developed during the Deep Horizon 7 mission, showing how atmospheric pressure differentials could be used for navigation, how hurricane circulation patterns could provide additional lift, and how the aircraft's computer systems could process environmental data faster than human reflexes could respond. The transformation in aircraft performance was immediate and dramatic. Instead of struggling against atmospheric forces that threatened to tear the aircraft apart, Elena's techniques allowed the simulated Osprey to move through hurricane conditions with precision and control that seemed to violate the laws of physics. "How is that possible?" Torres asked, studying the flight data that showed Elena achieving stable flight in conditions that had defeated his conventional approaches. "You're flying in wind speeds that should make aircraft control impossible." Elena's answer reflected 6 months of analysis and refinement of techniques that had been developed under emergency conditions. "Because I'm not trying to control the aircraft using manual inputs that fight against atmospheric forces. I'm using the hurricane's own circulation patterns to provide stability and lift, while allowing the flight computers to manage the micro-corrections necessary to maintain precise positioning." Elena spent the next hour demonstrating techniques that would have been considered impossible before Hurricane Beatrice forced the development of new approaches to extreme weather flying. She showed how atmospheric pressure mapping could be used for navigation when visual references were completely obscured, how wind patterns around large structures could be exploited to create zones of relative calm, and how computer-assisted flying could achieve precision that exceeded human capabilities in severe turbulence. "The key to understanding extreme weather flying," Elena explained as she concluded the demonstration, "is recognizing that your training has prepared you to fly in normal conditions, but rescue operations often require flying in conditions that don't exist in any training curriculum." Elena looked around the classroom at pilots who represented decades of combined flight experience, men and women who had conducted rescue operations in every type of emergency imaginable. But she could see in their faces the recognition that they were learning approaches to aviation that could expand their capabilities beyond anything they had previously considered possible. 6 months ago, I was considered unqualified for V-22 operations because I couldn't follow standardized procedures," Elena continued. her voice carrying the confidence that came from having proven that innovation could succeed where convention failed. Today, those same unconventional techniques are being incorporated into training programs that will prepare future rescue pilots for missions that we previously considered impossible. Elena activated another simulation scenario, this one based on real weather data from Hurricane Delilah, the storm that had prompted the development of Elena's staging area concept. Who wants to attempt a multi-platform rescue operation using atmospheric exploitation techniques? Several hands went up immediately, pilots eager to learn approaches that could save lives in situations where conventional methods proved inadequate. Elena smiled as she realized that she was no longer the communications officer who had failed flight training 3 times. She had become something entirely different, an instructor who could teach others to succeed in conditions where standard training failed to provide adequate preparation. Remember, Elena said as the pilots took turns on the simulator, extreme weather flying isn't about abandoning safety or ignoring aircraft limitations. It's about expanding your understanding of what's possible when you work with natural forces, instead of fighting against them. Elena's secure phone buzzed with a distinctive tone that indicated an emergency communication from fleet operations. She glanced at the display and recognized the caller, Admiral Montgomery, who had continued to seek Elena's expertise for rescue operations that required unconventional approaches. Elena, Admiral Montgomery's voice carried the familiar mix of urgency and confidence that marked critical mission communications. We have a situation developing in the North Atlantic. A research vessel with 43 crew members is trapped in pack ice during a major storm system. Weather conditions are beyond the operational limits of conventional rescue aircraft. Elena felt the familiar surge of analytical satisfaction as her mind began processing the technical challenges that a North Atlantic ice rescue would present. This would be a completely different type of extreme weather flying, requiring techniques that incorporated Arctic atmospheric conditions and the unique challenges of operating near polar ice formations. Admiral, I'll need complete meteorological data, vessel position coordinates, and ice thickness measurements. What's our operational window? Admiral Montgomery's response carried a note of satisfaction. Elena, you'll be leading a joint Navy Coast Guard operation using techniques that are based on your hurricane flying innovations. The question isn't whether conventional procedures can handle this mission, it's whether your approaches can be adapted to Arctic conditions. Elena looked around the classroom at pilots who were still practicing hurricane simulation exercises, then back at the phone that was offering her another opportunity to develop new techniques for impossible rescue operations. Admiral, Elena said, her voice reflecting the confidence of someone who had learned to see solutions where others saw only limitations. When do we launch? As Elena prepared to tackle another mission that would push the boundaries of what was considered possible in aviation, she realized that Hurricane Beatrice had done more than save 127 lives. It had revealed that the future of rescue operations lay not in following established procedures, but in continuously developing new approaches to challenges that conventional training couldn't address. The storm had taught her to fly, but more importantly, it had taught her that innovation was not a weakness to be corrected, but a strength to be developed and shared with others who faced the impossible task of saving lives when everything else had failed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.